And so I went to the CIA anthropologists and psychologists, and I asked them, and they said, look at how we recruit people back in the development. What you're doing is using the law of reciprocity, and you're applying it consistently. And all the law of reciprocity, as chief anthropologist told me, he said, look, it's, we study one tribe gives one tribe beads and the other one gives them back seashells. And he said, it's not the gifting, it is the transactional consistency.
My name's Mike Lander, and you're listening to Higgle, the B2B Sales Club podcast, where we bring you actionable insights about sales RFPs, negotiations, and difficult procurement discussions from sales leaders, brand leaders, and procurement leaders. Please subscribe to get updates when new episodes are released. Listeners, this is a slightly different episode. I've got Mike Mears with me today. For those of you that don't know Mike, and many of you won't, he was a Cold War spy. He also started and ran the CIA Leadership Academy and then retired as CIA's chief of HR. So I'm really, really, really pleased to have Mike on the show. Mike, welcome.
Thank you, Mike. It's delightful to be here.
I'm really looking forward to this. So what I've done is, so again, for listeners, I've broken this into 2 episodes because there's a lot that I want to talk about. Episode 1 is about Mike's background, lessons learned on leadership, human behavior. And the second part, which will be released next week, is all about the parallels between spying and selling and what lessons sales leaders can learn from the world of espionage. So really interesting episode with lots and lots of parallels and lots of stories and hopefully some good fun as well. So Mike, to kick us off with this first episode, what's your favorite song and why?
You're going to think I'm pandering to the audience, but my radio just broke, the digital part. And so it means I can listen to one station I can't select. And I stumbled into a station that plays nothing but Beatles songs, if you can imagine that. Just before we linked up, how many songs did these guys write? Anyway, so that's a general category. But my favorite would be Bob Dylan, our poet laureate here in the U.S.
Exactly.
Everything that he did is fantastic.
Any particular one or any of Bob Dylan's songs?
Oh, you know what? This is embarrassing. My wife just walked around behind me because I'm in my home office, and she said, just like a woman. That's not my favorite, but we'll go on the record with that.
Exactly. I think he wrote All Along the Watchtower, but the one that is famous is Jimi Hendrix's version.
Isn't that something? It's stunning to look at the amount of things he wrote. So many of those songs, like you say, Jimi Hendrix picked that up, and that's such a powerful song with Hendrix doing it.
Yeah, amazing. So before our listeners think we're on a radio show about audio and about records, let's get into the content. Just talk me through, Mike, your backstory and how you ended up as a spy in the Cold War and then in the CIA.
Started out, I'd gone to West Point undergrad, which is our Sandhurst, and I had 5 years in the military back in the Vietnam era. So I was in a combat platoon. I ran there. And then I got out of the military and went to Harvard Business School to learn a trade, basically. And I did something unexpected, which was I just left Harvard Business School when I graduated and didn't take a job. I was the only guy in the class who just went the entrepreneurial route. I would start up little companies and sell them off and then start up new ones. My wife would tell you I'd made $1 million on one and lost it on the other and made it on one and lost it. And I won't tell you whether it was an odd or even number, how I ended up. But anyway, no, I approached the CIA after that, offering to be something called a cover sponsor, which means I would take one of my companies and say an officer was working for me who maybe was undercover. But they picked up on the fact that I had a deep financial background and there were some real issues in everything from global finance to drug monies to everything. So they pulled me up for a visit and then pitched me to come work for them. So that's how it happened. It was serendipitous, basically.
Amazing.
I had seen a little display ad in the newspaper for translators, and that's what made me write it. And then they came back and got me. So I had basically 2 parts of my career where one was what we would call covert, which is what you think of in spy world, about half of my career. And then the other half was overt, which had the odd sensation I could tell people where I worked, that I worked for CIA. So in the covert, still won't let me go into that.
No, I can imagine.
That was in 2 halves. One half, I was working with truly nasty people in the world who if they knew I was CIA, would kill me. So there was a stress level there. And then the second half was in what we call denied areas, which is if you basically make a mistake, they won't kill you, but they would kill your agent. In other words, if you're meeting with Russians who are providing secret documents. And by the way, if this is of interest to folks, I'll throw out my two favorite Cold War spy books that are the two best ever written, I think.
Yes.
One of them is called The $1 Billion Spy, which is about a man named Tolkachev who literally gave us in the late 80s all information on Soviet avionics, aircraft, and radar today and 20 years in the future, because he worked at a design. That's why they call him the $1 Billion Spy. So they're about to make a movie in Hollywood on that book called $1 Billion Spy, and Russell Crowe will be,
Oh, amazing.
I think, starring in that. Yeah. Now, I don't know whether he's me and my compatriots, CIA officer, or is he Tolkachev? I don't know which role he'll play. But anyway, keep your eye out for them. The other one is closer to home to you, which is The Spy and the Traitor. And it's probably the most remarkable spy story there is. And it was about a man named Gordievsky, who was the London residence chief for the KGB in London. The Brits had recruited him. And so here you've got a guy who's basically, like we call him, a station chief, giving the British everything there was about the KGB, the Russians, Politburo thinking and everything. But that book, the reason I throw it out there for you is it is so well written and it's so exciting. It's like a beach read. If you picked it up and read it, you'd think it's totally fiction.
Yeah,
but I
yeah.
won't tell you what happens, but the Russians find out Gordievsky is working for the UK, and that's when it starts to get truly interesting. But anyway, there you go.
Do you have friends that were part of that at that time?
I can't talk a lot about that, but yes.
This is going to be a fascinating episode where Mike says, I can't talk about that. Let's move on. And that's fine. That's partly why I invited on you the show as well. So let's go into the next question. What did you learn about human behaviors, motivations, and how agents built relationships with counterparties in your role as Chief of Human Capital at the CIA? Listeners, just be aware of like Mike's background. Mike, talk about stories, but probably not about names, I suspect. But what did you learn?
You set me off when we met, and I started thinking more and more about espionage and sales. And it's always explosive when you take two disciplines and bring them together. So my brain has been sparking ever since I met you. But one thing, when I became overt, for a while I worked for GE, Jack Welch.
Yes, for Jack Welch.
Hit for about 9 years during the heyday of GE. So I had all these different cultural experiences, small business, big business, GE, most best run company in the world back then at the time, and then government and all this. So it really gave me kind of rich background. And so when I was an overt employee, one of the jobs George Tenet, who was director, gave me, said, Mike, I want you to start up a leadership academy, and we're going to pull all the leadership training together in one school, and I want you to run that thing. What an opportunity that is.
Amazing.
So what I did, I said, okay, what if we start with leadership? Sales is exactly the same. But what if we start with leadership and throw out everything we know and just start over based on human nature?
Right.
What would we come up with? I had the director of operations, which is what you think of as the spy side, and they've got hosts of psychologists who really look at human vulnerabilities, basically how the brain confuses us, self-awareness, all this beautiful richness. Now, they're looking at it, of course, not to sell a product, but to be able to recruit people. And we can get into that in a minute. There's some fascinating overlap there.
Well, that would be very interesting about how you recruit people, both CIA agents, but also counterparties. How do you recruit a counterparty in a foreign territory? Principles must be very similar, one would imagine.
Absolutely. And MI6 does sort of the same type pattern. But then the other area was our director of analysis. And what they do, they got to send intelligence reports up to the president. You can't get it wrong. So they've got legions of psychologists working on what are called cognitive biases. You know, we have all these biases, about a couple hundred in our head that we snap to make a decision. We jump to conclusions. We have the negativity bias. We fill in blanks when there's not enough data for the brain to. There's literally several hundred of these. And they had a group working on that. So between the two, CIA had a unique view of human nature to start with. And then I collected data on a couple hundred best bosses. First, I went after the attributes and found that wasn't helpful because have integrity, trustworthy, but you can't act on those. Those are platitudes. So then we drilled into what are the behaviors. And my next step was I had about 25 really simple behaviors, but I clumped them into categories. The first clump is basically build psychological safety with somebody. This applies to sales. Second is build trust. You're not going to build trust if people feel psychologically unsafe, but that was the second one. And then the third one is clarity, because once you got trust and psychological safety, now there's a meeting of the minds and, oh, I see the expectations you have for me. There's this clarity. Only then can you really challenge the hell out of somebody because they're safe, they trust you, it's perfectly crystal clear, and they can go. But stepping back, it's fascinating. You talk about how do you recruit. We had the recruiting cycle, we call it. And now you think sales cycle while I talk. The recruiting cycle was spot, assess, develop, recruit.
Right.
So spotting is I'm in Madrid, I'm walking down the street, and I hear some guy talking on his cell phone. He's talking in Russian. Whoa, that might be a prospect. Then I follow him into a bar, and now I'm going to start the assessment process because what I'm interested in is does he have access to secret information? Is he have potential interest in my product or service like you guys would be? So the assessment process can be lengthy, it can be short, but you would call that qualifying customer.
Exactly. So Mike, on the qualification in your world, is there a science behind it or was it more instinctive?
A little of both because we have mass databases, people from years and years and years. This is even before internet, phenomenal amount of information on a lot of people everywhere. So like a Russian diplomat, we would have had some basic information on him that during the assessment, I collect data that he's interested in Chinese antique porcelain. And then at the agency, they're cross-checking that information to see, yeah, that's true. So we're also checking kind of bona fides, truthfulness and all of that. There's a lot of intuition and a lot of science both that go in that. Then you start what we call the development phase, which is, and again, the Brits do the same thing, but what you're doing is you're going to form a psychological bond with this person. It's incredibly strong because you're going to pitch him for a sales that is highly dangerous.
Now, at this point, Mike, do both parties know that both of you are in the intelligence game?
No. In other words, I would probably, on average, let's say I was usually in a different position. People would think I had a totally different position. But let's say your average, what we call case officer, which is you'd call a spy, is somebody who's got a position in an embassy. Maybe they're the third secretary in the political office or something like that. So whatever their cover is, that's what would be told to the individual. And it can be awkward because at some point you got to expose, hey, we're really CIA.
Yeah.
So that the development phase is absolutely fascinating because this is sales too. I think if you're selling, you have to trust.
You're building trust. You're building rapport. You're building trust. You're collaborating. You're building solutions together. You're doing what I call, you're getting the client or the prospect to put their fingerprints on your solution so that they own your solution.
That's a separate issue, but I've been working with 9 psychologists and neuroscientists. That's interesting what you just said, because that's a concept of getting buy-in. If you get people to participate, you get buy-in. So I love that. I really do.
In an ethical way, you're getting them to collaborate and buy into solving a problem in a certain way that has certain benefits.
Let me throw out one other. We'll talk about this later if you want to, but when I was at CIA, there's a mechanism in the brain called the insight mechanism, had not been discovered yet. It wasn't until well after 9/11.
What's it called, Mike?
Well, there was a book, I wouldn't bother to read it, but it's called The Eureka Factor. by John Cunios and Mark Beeman. They're two Drexel neuroscientists who got together and they start talking about insight. And when you're talking about decision making and making a choice to buy something, you got two mechanisms. One would be the analytical, kind of the logical grind, right? But sometimes something magical happens in the brain. It's just a flash of insight. So Beeman and Cunios were arguing over this thing. The psychologists say that they think this is just suddenly a speed up of logic and analytical thing. We don't think so. And so they were each experts in different types of scanning. And so what they discovered, and this is going to get a little eerie, so bear with me.
Yeah, carry on.
Literally, they found there's an explosion of energy right above your right ear, about the size of a dime. And when that occurs, new neuron connections are made instantaneously. This is bizarre. And I started working with Cunios on this, and I asked him one time, I said, well, what brain chemicals have you studied those to see what's released at the moment of an insight? And they said, believe it or not, it is a cocktail of various brain chemicals that get together that give you a sense of complete certainty.
Wow. So is this overriding the prefrontal cortex?
Yes, it's operating totally outside what we think of as the logical brain. The guy named Daniel Kahneman wrote a book, Thinking Fast and Slow. I would recommend that for every salesperson to read. But it's on the logical brain, which we think runs us, which most of the time it doesn't. And then there's this kind of automatic brain that's got our emotions in there, instincts, cognitive biases, habitual behaviors. That's what we run on during the day. So tapping into that is absolutely crucial. But anyway, so that's how the insight occurs. And it's got to be a time you have to be in a relaxed state. So having insight at the office is really tough. And so what I'm working with now are especially business leaders who, if you give somebody mental homework, an employee, they're going to have to think about that because you're the boss. And they will think about it on the drive to and from work, and they're going to be in a relaxed state. And when they have an insight on it, long-winded way to get back to your buy-in method. When that insight occurs, you've got somebody who's got absolute certainty. Yes, this is the right way to go.
We hear about people, and I've had this as well, where in the shower in the morning,
yes,
suddenly something will occur to you. And it's an overriding dominant, instinctive, feels like instinctive. That's what I should do. That's the right thing to do. And it can be solving problems. I had a director once, a very senior R&D director. He used to have these flashes when he was in the bath. He'd be having a bath, he'd be all relaxed, and then he'd get his pen and paper and write something down because he's in a relaxed state.
Isn't that something? Archimedes was in the bath too. Came up with the whole idea of displacement. It solved the king's problem of, is this crown really gold or not? Well, he could get the weight, but he couldn't get the volume. So sitting in a bathtub in ancient Greece, he saw the water rise. And he thought,
displacement.
That's the missing link. I followed up on this. This is a little prurient, but he did run through the streets naked. He was so excited saying, Eureka, Eureka, right. Eureka. But seriously, if you can, and I don't know how you do it on the sales side because you're not in a position of authority. I call these insight prompts where you give mental homework to somebody. Hey, get back to me in 2 weeks with your idea on how we do this better or whatever it is. If you're in a position of authority, you've got that push to get them to do it. And it's a nudge basically to get people to have insights.
So the important lesson here is, if you're thinking about a sales cycle or in fact a negotiation, which normally lasts over several weeks, sometimes months, giving each other things to think about. For example, salesperson's going, we might be able to do that, but can you think about, as the buyer, could you and your organization look at it this way? Would that work? What might the complications be? Because we've tried it before, it's not worked. Could you come back to me? If you give the buyer some homework in a high value, high stakes deal, and you give them time, and 3 days later, they often message you, they'll email, they'll WhatsApp, they'll call and go, I've had to think about this, and you can sell the signs. I've had to think about this. Something occurred to me. And that's what you're talking about, I think, isn't it?
Yes, and it is hard. Let's say it would be very difficult for an employee to do that to a boss, unless the boss really was a person who acts in good faith and said, yes, I'll take this on. You're absolutely right. And let me tell you, if anybody uses this, I wish they would get back to you and me and let us know how that worked out. But you want a quick CIA story on that?
Definitely.
We were hunting for bin Laden.
I watched the documentary recently with our family. It was amazing.
What he did, a newsman published that CIA could monitor cell phones. So people know that today, but that was unknown back then. And he went dark. He cut off all communications, all digital, got rid of computers, and went with a trusted courier basically to communicate. So that's why it was so difficult. But anyway, Leon Panetta was the director, and he was holding the Wednesday bin Laden meeting, 5 o'clock. And there was a room full of operations officers and analysts and so forth. And finally, he turned to this one hapless chap and he says to him, said, "What ideas do you have to catch bin Laden?" The officer said, "Chief, I don't know. I'm out of ideas. The whole group is out of ideas." Panetta flared up and then he said, "I'm sorry, this is not you I'm angry at. It's just the situation." He did what a good leader would do, pulled himself back, and he said, "Okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to adjourn the meeting. You guys think and talk for a week and then come back and bring me 10 new ideas to catch bin Laden." That is what I call the mental prompt. You give them homework. It's the CIA director, for goodness sake, so you're going to have to. So a week later, they come back and they have 37 new ideas to catch bin Laden. That's how this works. And they're bought into their own ideas. They came up with them, so they bought it. I didn't think we'd get off on that because I don't know how sales people could use that, but I am going to be fascinated to hear if anything comes of it.
So let's just talk about also now, Mike, because I'm conscious of the second episode, which we'll be doing quite soon, actually. Let's talk about your book, Certainty, How Great Bosses Can Change Minds and Drive Innovation. What led you to write that book, and what were the kind of insights about uncertainty, social pain, reciprocity, etc.?
Talking about applying to sales, it's amazing. But that obviously is the book, Certainty. And it stemmed from, I was at one point the chief counselor, senior counselor to the deputy director of operations, that's the spy master, for leadership and management stuff. So I'm the guru that knows everything, right? So I got a phone call from the director's office saying, "Come up right away. He needs to talk to you." Anybody who has ever worked anywhere knows you
That's
don't
not
like
normally
the
a good
call that
sign.
says, "Come see me right away." Your fear jumps up and you think, "God, what have I done now? Am I going to get fired?" And so I gave him the old, "Well, can you tell me what it's about?" And they said, "Oh, no." He said, "Just get up here right away. It's important." So I went rushing up there and he asked a very simple question that changed my life forever. And it was a simple question, which was, "Mike, why is it when I pull the levers, nothing happens?" I knew what he meant because we talked about the levers. They have one-way communications, metrics, reward systems, training, kind of the standard traditional management stuff. And I was dumbfounded because I was the expert and I had not a clue. So honestly, it's been 25 years now, but I've been thinking about that question every day is, okay, why don't the levers work? What is it about the human brain gets in the way? And half of the answer is basically the survival instinct. We think we're better than that. We're not cavemen, but we got the same brain. So unconsciously, that survival mechanism is always clicking. So if you're trying to make a sale with somebody, there is that mechanism of threat and reward working unconsciously, but it's there. And so after starting to work with these neuroscientists and cognitive scientists, what found was that the brain really, on the safety side, the threat side, basically, it wants certainty. That's all it wants. So hence the name of the book was Certainty. And one part of certainty, back to this model I was working on at CIA of best bosses, was establish psychological safety. That's step one. Step two is trust. And how do you build trust? And so I went to the CIA anthropologists and psychologists, and I asked them, and they said, look at how we recruit people back in the development. What you're doing is using the law of reciprocity, and you're applying it consistently. And all the law of reciprocity is, chief anthropologist told me, he said, look, it's, we study one tribe gives one tribe beads and the other one gives them back seashells. And he said, it's not the gifting. It is the transactional consistency. And that's why if you've got access to secrets and some guy with a Russian accent walks up to you and learns again that you're interested in Chinese porcelain, and the next time you meet, he's got a book that is the rarest book ever on Chinese porcelain. He said, look what I just happened to find. That's that law of reciprocity. Believe it or not, it works.
It absolutely works.
And I want to shoot you a list because this is one of my favorite old books, was Influence Without Authority. And it's a good psychological approach for sales folks to look at how do you influence that buyer when you have no authority. One of the pages has got lists of what they call currencies. And these currencies, or you could call them coins or gifts or whatever you want to call them, but they clump them, which is kind of nice. These intrinsic type rewards of recognition, that's a gift. Information, some people are information hogs, love that. Some people, sense of vision or rapid response for some people is really important. So it's kind of know your customer. Reputation, contact sharing, understanding, just something as simple as that. Oh, yeah, I really understand. Being empathetic with somebody. All these are little gifts. And I'll shoot you a list of about 30 of them because they really do apply to sales just like they do to espionage. It's absolutely fascinating. But anyway, that's that trust building thing. So if you got the psychological safety and you built the trust, then you've got certainty in the employee's mind in my world, but in the client or potential customer's mind in your world. And that's when you could start to develop this clarity or meeting of the minds. Is this what we can do for you? This is what we can't do for you, and really get a full understanding of how it's all going to click.
So let me ask you a question then. In a majority of sales situations, and I can say as a buyer, having been on the buy side, what always starts to occur is risk. The thing about certainty is absolutely true, which is we agree there's a problem to solve and we agree what the outcome looks like. And then we talk to a sales organization, a salesperson, and we start crafting a solution together. And the problem that occurs is the bigger the problem gets, the bigger the reward is, but the bigger the risks are. So the less certainty we have. And this is exactly speaking into the problem. My problem is, how much certainty do I have that this is going to work? Salesperson's desperate to sell the deal. I'm nervous. And unless you can start to reduce my fear and increase my certainty, the deals stall. You get ghosted, as we would say in sales.
Interesting, yeah.
People drift away because there's too much risk. No one says no. People just kind of stop talking to you. Did that kind of come up at all in your research about certainty and how you can create more certainty for someone?
What you just pointed out too is you got to do kind of continuous light probing of where that person is because they can drift away. You know, things change. Personal situation could change. The corporate policies could change. So you're always going to have to probe that more. I had a funny interchange. I met a Boston cop. This is kind of a stereotype, right? In a bar last week. And I just asked him, I said, what was your biggest lesson? He said, oh, I got it from my boss. He said, I went to my boss. It was going to be the first time I had to interview a burglary suspect. So I'm doing the police interview, right? And I said, Chief, what do I do? And my boss looked at me and said, shut up. So I kind of went back. And then the wheels start to slowly turn. And he realizes, oh, you mean I shouldn't talk? And the boss said, yes, listen. That's the hardest thing for recruiters of spies or salespeople, I think, is to be able to ask open-ended questions and then do that active listening. I mean, this is so basic, but it's so hard to accomplish. But that's a big part on trying to plot that wandering that can go on with basically your target. You know, you think you got them, but suddenly things go askew. And anytime anybody gets depressed, just remember my sales job was to find the Russian and spot assess, develop using a law of reciprocity. And then I'm pitching him, and my pitch is, Mike, I'm actually working for the CIA, and I need for you to give me top secret documents, and you can get killed if you're caught.
Yeah. Doesn't sound very appetizing, Mike.
It could be worse. The product could be worse than what they're dealing with.
So in almost like one sentence, one paragraph, what did you find from writing the book? What was the key thing, the key insight? What was the trigger? What was the insight that came out?
How simple some of this stuff is. You and I had talked earlier, and let me just give you a quick example. You had talked about what advice would I say I give a sales manager? And this is so simple, it's absolutely ridiculous, but it's something I'm working on a project now. And Gallup, the organization, does workplace polling and leadership assessment. So they're working on this too, which is weekly praise. So again, talking about that backsliding of the customer that could go on. Remember that angst is always there is what I make a decision on going to hurt me? And on the opposite side is how is it going to help me? That's always going on in their minds. So it is so important to kind of know where that all fits in. So what I figured was basically, and I'll go for the employee now, all employees inside their unconscious at the core, we're getting at core human needs. It's, hey, boss, are you mad at me? Hey, do my peers respect me? Is what I'm doing worthwhile? Am I making a difference here? I mean, you're talking pretty basic concerns that we don't address in the workplace because we're busy with our KPIs and metrics and all this stuff. And so what I've been working on is what happens if you gave each employee praise once a week. So what happens, this is fascinating. If HR gives your salesperson a little certificate that week, that's great. It's an extrinsic reward, and it actually affects the brain, gives a little shot of dopamine. So it feels good. I did a good job. I'm satisfied for a little while. And now let's take the boss. A sales manager wants to motivate his sales force. What I discovered is something primal about a boss individual employee relationship. And what I say that there was several meta studies on cultures around the world where what's common among prehistoric cultures, current cultures, and everything from cultures in New Guinea, Papua New Guinea to London. Some interesting things pop out. I mean, like dance. Isn't that interesting? All cultures have had dance. But here's one that just stuck with me was all cultures have leaders.
Uh-huh.
So for some reason, it helps our survival that we give up our autonomy toward a leader. So what I'm saying is that relationship is primal between the leader and the employee. So when HR says you did a good job, you get a little spike of dopamine. But this is fascinating. When the sales manager tells the salesman, hey, I just wanted to say you did a great job with XYZ contract, that sparks dopamine, serotonin, and several other positive brain chemicals that create both a sense of psychological safety and trust at the same time. Oxytocin is another one that's spread. So isn't that interesting that HR can do it, it's good, but when a boss actually says that, so when the boss says that, that dispels all that angst underneath of is the boss mad at me, yada, 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 where do I stand, and so on. For about a week, it's got a half-life. Gallup is doing a parallel study on this, so I'm looking more into it. But that was, I think, the long-winded answer to what I got right in the book. But what I got right in the book is how simple all this is. It's just we don't do it.
Exactly.
For a whole host of reasons.
That's the end of episode 1 with Mike Mears. Tune in next week for episode 2, where we start to really get into how do you apply his rich insights to the world of sales. I look forward to having you on the show on episode 2. Thanks for listening to Higgle, the B2B Sales Club podcast series with your host, Mike Lander. Please subscribe so that you'll catch all the next episodes.